everyone can be a leader, but those that are at the top must be a leader.
To me, a leader is someone who kind of catalyzes a positive change in an organization. Someone who sees opportunities that others don't. Someone who's able to mobilize resources across the company to meet a new challenge. Someone who is highly respected for their contribution. There's no reason why a 20,000 person company needs to have 7 layers or 8 layers. The question is like, how do you build that hierarchy? And we think it needs to be built bottom up as opposed to top down. You need to be human so that people can kind of maximize their contribution. But the management model, we would argue, is the fundamental driver of the organizational capability. It's upstream from the business model. But what you need to distinguish is between time to decision and time to impact. Leadership is less about positional power and more about relational. The organizational DNA, the organizational operating system, whatever metaphor you want to use, that runs most large-scale organizations is built on a set of principles that might have made sense 150 years ago, 100 years ago, but no longer makes sense today. To me, like, the whole company should be a laboratory for innovation. That's insane. You're basically telling 80% of the company that they shouldn't
think strategically.
Don't think strategically. It's insane. The job of people who are in positional power is to multiply leaders, create more leaders. We would argue that there is a moral imperative because to treat people better at work and allow each person to flourish and be the best they can be in the workplace. What doesn't work is to focus almost exclusively on individual traits and characteristics of leaders. The evidence is like, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars in leadership development around these things and it doesn't work. You have to make those kinds of demanding changes to the organization if you want to hope for something different than the status quo.
So, welcome everyone to our next Agile Insights conversation. Today I'm joined by Michele Zanini. This is our second conversation. Actually, the first time Michele gave a presentation as part of the Agile 100 conference, which I was hosting back then. And I was so excited because he was one of the first people whose book I had read, and I was able to get him to do this conversation or give this presentation with us. Michele is the co-author with Gary Hamel together from Humanocracy. That book was published in August of 2020. And I still believe this is one of those timeless management books that every leader that wants to make a meaningful change in their organization should read. I've been through this book several times. I reference a lot of the case studies in the Agile leader trainings that I give. I frequently talk about the concepts. I try to implement some of those things in my organization, despite not being that big. And I think all of the case studies in there are from huge organizations, which shows that these concepts can be applied really, really, really at scale. And I'm super happy to have Michele with me again. In the meantime, we spoke several times, and then I thought it would be great to run this conversation in front of a public, or like on a public square, and make it available to other people after that. So Michele, thank you for joining me today. A very, very warm welcome to today's conversation.
Thanks, Sohrab. Delighted to be here with you today, and good to see you again.
Yeah. So today, Michele, in preparation of this interview, you and I emailed back and forth. And basically what I want to talk about today is a topic that you brought up, like the conventional wisdom on leadership, and to some extent how empty that is, and also how much it doesn't fit today's day and age. And I'd like to deep dive on that topic with you. The next thing, and that's connected then obviously, is what works, actually? When we talk about management or leadership, and I know you have your own opinion on these two terms and how it came that we're today talking more and more about leadership and not so much about management, but what do we know today? What works? And then I want to talk about, this is a topic very much covered in this book, like the human side of it. How can we make it human-centric? There's a reason you called this book Humanocracy, which I always looked at is like putting the human beings at the center of what we do in organizations, either be it our customers and even more importantly, our employees, right? The people doing the work, creating the value. And once we define why this is important, we can talk about how this can look like and what it takes to get there. And as side conversation, we will probably end up talking about what new work or the future of work is in general, and also maybe opportunities that were presented during COVID and opportunities that might present themselves in the potential downturn that we're all going to face on a global scale. So there's lots to cover. We have about 60 minutes, and we'll go as far as we can. And whatever topic remains, I'm sure I can get you for another interview.
No problem. Sounds like a pretty full agenda. So let's dive in.
Let's dive in. So you mentioned in your email that you want to bring up this topic of like the conventional wisdom on leadership. And let's start with that one. Maybe you can share with me, what do you consider being the conventional wisdom on leadership and why you are so critical about it?
Yeah. So I think you mentioned leadership as one of the topics you wanted to talk about, and that just triggered me because that topic, that term triggers me all the time. And so I'll try not to go on a rant, and I'll try not to go off on the deep end. But and actually, so to prevent me from doing that, maybe I'll ask you a question, Sohrab, and you can answer it. So when people like your clients, people you know, talk about the leadership team of the organization, who do they refer to? Who are they speaking about?
Yeah, they usually refer to C-level and in many cases also the first level of command, like below that, right? That's usually when they talk about leadership team, that's what they mean. If we're talking to someone in an organizational unit, when they talk about leadership team, they mean the leadership team of that particular organizational unit. But it's usually the people at the top, maybe one below that.
Right. So it's the top of the pyramid. So there is a basically a reference to direct correlation, right, between your positional authority, like your position in the pecking order, and whether or not you're a leader. And so that is, you know, the typical way, the standard way people think about it, that leadership is nothing more than your relative position in a positional hierarchy. And you know, I would say that's a very limited and very narrow definition of leadership. I mean, it's fine. You can kind of call it that, and we can get into why that has actually become more and more prevalent. You know, those people used to be called managers, the senior managers, now they're called leaders. And we can kind of get into that. But to me, you know, the reason why I find this whole debate about leadership so frustrating is because, to me, a leader is someone quite different. So to me, a leader is someone who kind of catalyzes positive change in an organization, right? Someone who sees opportunities that others don't. Someone who's able to mobilize resources across the company to meet a new challenge. You know, someone who is, highly respected for their contribution, whether it's technical or in terms of, stitching together a coalition of people who are, passionate about a problem that needs to be solved. So, and to me, those kinds of capabilities of leadership have very little to do with whether or not you're an EVP. Yeah. And in fact, you could even argue that those are the kind of capabilities that the system doesn't select for when it's promoting EVPs, right? Mm-hmm. And so by the way, the other thing about that whole leadership team thing is, it not only is it narrow in terms of defining who's a leader, but then it also ascribes a level of collaboration across people in that team that is often not there. They're typically not a team, right? They're all kind of competing with each other and mindful of their own parochial prerogatives and kind of trying to move those along. So to me, when you a lot of the leadership discourse in the management literature and inside of companies and in leadership development and all of that is when it's premised on this assumption that leaders are people who are in the top rungs of a managerial ladder. To me, that just is not very helpful, and it will limit us in our ability to really unleash leadership where it matters and where it sits, which is, as I said, across the entire company. So unless we kind of deprogram that old way of thinking about leadership, we're just not going to get very far.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. Now, I have a question about that, Michele. And the question would be the following. So I fully agree that you can have leadership across the organization. As you mentioned, right? A leader is someone who mobilizes a group of people to address a challenge that the organization is facing. And that can be someone like at the very bottom of the pyramid, even like if we have the pyramid in front of our eyes. But shouldn't the people at the top of the pyramid definitely live leadership? So everyone can be a leader, but those that are at the top must be a leader.
Yeah, so sorry, you froze there for a second, but I think I got your question. So stop me if I didn't. Yeah, so I would say that I am not against hierarchy, and I'm not against having some hierarchy of positions where you do have people who are, there's a CEO, there's an EVP, and so on. I would say two things. First, the hierarchy, ought to be much flatter than it typically is.
100%.
So there's no reason why a 20,000 person company needs to have 7 layers or 8 layers. It's just like, to me, like the onus needs to be like, why do you need all those positions? So that's one thing. The other thing though is that, as you say, the people that ascend to those positions, need to be selected in a very different way, and their authority basically needs to be dynamic. So we talk about natural dynamic hierarchy. So we mean that is that a leader is someone who other people want to follow. So they're a natural leader. They add value to the organization in a way that others don't. It's not just about, we still believe in meritocracy. We have a whole chapter on meritocracy. We believe that, not everybody's going to have the same contribution on a particular topic. Some might have more to say or more to contribute than others. And so you want to be able to reward that. But the question is, like, how do you build that hierarchy? And we think it needs to be built bottom up as opposed to top down. Right now, it's typically built top down, where like big leaders appoint little leaders. No, it should rise, from the bottom. And so, and your leadership is essentially something that other people confer on you, your peers, or perhaps even your customers, based on the value that you're adding to them, as opposed to someone higher in the hierarchy, right? So it's natural in that way, and it's dynamic in the sense that your power waxes and wanes based on your value added, which means that if you're no longer adding value, people are not going to listen to you. People are not going to come to your meetings, and it doesn't take a coup or a leadership replacement like in the hierarchy for that to happen. Because if you wait for those kinds of changes to happen, they often happen very, very seldom and very, very late. And the people that, in a hierarchy, the people that replace incompetent managers are the people, very slow to do that, because often they're the ones who put them there to begin with. And so they have like also all this kind of bias and sunk costs, right, in making that position, that person work in that role. So it's about having leaders who are natural leaders, who their leadership capital is subject to their gets in a way mark to market, and is sort of dependent, and their authority depends on their value added at any given time. And then the last thing is, there are multiple of these hierarchies, because as I mentioned before, you may be great at dealing with customers, but maybe not so good at managing or bringing people together. You may not be such an inspiring, charismatic figure, and that's okay. But you have a leadership competence. You may not have another, or you may be good at solving technical problems, but not so much good at solving administrative problems. That's fine. What we need to do is have multiple of these leadership hierarchies, depending on the thing that needs to happen for the organization to thrive, the problem at hand. The issue with traditional leadership hierarchies or managerial hierarchies is that there's only one of these hierarchies, and the only skill that they select for is administrative competence.
Exactly.
And so they basically squash and make it difficult for people who are maybe not good administrators or may not care about that to express their leadership potential.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like, I'm not against to have a hierarchy, right? So people say, oh, it's all about flat organizations. Yeah, maybe flatter, I would say, but you still need a hierarchy. The question is, how do you build a hierarchy? And it's certainly not the way most companies do it.
Yeah, I think it's two things. Like, how do you build this hierarchy? And based on that, probably what do you expect from those people in higher ranks, right? How do they act? Because I think what I read a lot in Humanocracy, and what I would like immediately like put my name under it, is you don't expect them to act like the traditional CEO would act. Earlier, you mentioned a leader for you is someone who catalyzes change in the organization, right? And catalyzing something can be in some situations you deciding, but in most situations, if you want to make it in a sustainable manner, you act as the person who enables the decision-making process to happen, right? And I would expect when I work with senior managers, let's put it this way, to not confuse these two terms, and help them towards becoming better leaders, hopefully, it's a lot about skills that they have to learn on top of what they knew already, right? Instead of being the quick decision maker themselves, thinking about how can I enable other people, just in case of decisions, like make those decisions. So the natural dynamic hierarchies, I like that term a lot, and I'm probably going to use it at some of the places where I speak.
And it's multiple, right? It's multiple. And so it's multiple natural, sorry, maybe it's a mouthful, but it's multiple. There are multiple hierarchies depending on what it is that you're trying to do, you're trying to solve. It's more than just being good at administrating things, right?
Yeah.
It's about the natural aspect, how, and then it is about this dynamism. And the only other thing I would add, Sohrab, that you made me think is this notion that power and authority and leadership is less about position. And so it's less about positional power and more about relational power, right? You are in a really, and one of the case studies we have in the book is Southwest Airlines, which is a low cost airline in the U.S., but low cost doesn't mean shitty service the way it is in a lot of low cost airlines. It's amazing, actually. The customer experience is terrific. And an academic called, her name is Jody Gettel. She wrote a book about Southwest, and she talks about relational capital. And the fact that Southwest is amazing at kind of creating this horizontal, peer-to-peer, capital, and trust-based relationships that enable it to solve problems much more quickly and much more efficiently and effectively than a hierarchy would, because decision-making and action happens peer-to-peer in a community as opposed to in a kind of vertical hierarchy. And so if you are in a position of power, as you say, of positional power, how do you think about, as you say, making that shift from positional to relational, and how do you help others, protect others, resolve conflicts, harness the collective intelligence and collective imagination and initiative of the company for better ends. And so always default to syndicating decisions as opposed to kind of making decisions on your own. And it may feel at the beginning that you are being less efficient because it takes maybe a little bit longer to make a decision. But what you need to distinguish is between time to decision and time to impact, right? Absolutely. So time to decision may be a little bit slower, but time to impact is probably going to be almost always going to be faster, because once you've made the decision, everybody's on board because the people have been involved in it. And so you don't have to spend time selling it to people, persuading people, cajoling people, and you're not going to get as much resistance. And this is something, by the way, the former president of IBM and former CEO of Red Hat, Jim Whitehurst, we don't really talk about Red Hat much in the book, but it's a very interesting company. It's an open source Linux-based software company. They provide kind of the commercial version of Linux to the company. They're based on open source principles, and this whole idea of open and transparent and collaborative decision making is really part of what they do. And so he's very big on this idea that being open and participative in decision making will end up making decision making much more effective and faster when it comes to execution and impact.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also a matter of practice, right? An organization shifting from centralized decisions to decentralized decisions, obviously those decisions are going to be, if you just look at the speed of decision making, they're going to be slower because they don't have practice with it. But once they practice it over and over again, they still might not get as fast as the centralized, but I believe they can actually do, because in order to have a centralized decision being taken, think about the number of reports that people create and how many management layers it goes up and how much time goes in between one presentation and then feedback, then the next presentation. So with the practice, in addition to the time to impact, as you mentioned, which is the much more relevant metric here than the time to decision, I believe organization can do something phenomenal. Now, we already went into this topic a bit, right? What are the things? So if we leave aside the conventional wisdom on leadership, and one of them being that leadership is positional, not relational, but there are also other things that are part of the conventional wisdom on leadership. Now, what works based on the research that you have done yourself, the research that you've read about, the organizations that you've seen? What are the core principles, and there are many covered in Humanocracy, that from your experience work in both small, mid-size, and large organizations?
When it comes to leadership?
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, maybe try to, I don't know if I'm answering your question. If not, call me out on it. But I tell you, like, what doesn't work, for sure, I can guarantee you it doesn't work, is to focus almost exclusively on individual traits and characteristics of leaders. So this whole idea of being a servant leader, this whole idea of being an authentic leader, this whole idea of being a compassionate leader, this whole idea of being a courageous leader, an emotionally intelligent leader. I mean, you can come up with any adjective, positive adjective, in the dictionary, and I guarantee you there'll be a book about it with leadership next to it, right? I mean, it's basically, that's the whole, the last 30 years, it's just like thousands of books about the X leader, and the X is always like something like a good virtue or a characteristic that you want to highlight. And like, of course, like in a way, you don't want a leader to be a narcissist, and a psychopath or a sociopath or something, of course. But the problem, and this is basically, this is in terms of like, the clear-cut evidence of this is been screaming at us since the 1950s, that if that's all you do, if you take people, you bring them together for a week, 2 weeks, you kind of try to deprogram their old beliefs, you get them to think differently about their role, it's like incredibly powerful experience, right, for them. And they come back and, they may have some interesting things that they can try and practice to what back to your point. And then almost invariably, within 6 months, things go back to the way they were before. And it's either because the person is like tired that, they're dealing with an organization that doesn't recognize the qualities that they've just learned and want to practice, or because the person kind of gets the message that, that's not how you get ahead, right? In the organization. And so literally, like, their Ohio State University ran these studies back in the 40s and the 1950s around the fact that individual leadership training of that kind, those kinds of skills don't work. Not to go back too much into history, but there's a whole like set of, a huge program involving thousands of managers, if not hundreds of thousands of managers, called sensitivity training, or T groups, in the 60s and the early 70s, where people were literally going for a week or two offsite, came back as, understanding all the flaws, like how much of an a-hole they were in meetings, and with their subordinates, and how they were going to change that. And that, within 6 months, to a year, things were back to where they were, and more and more, and so the evidence is like, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars in leadership development around these things, and it doesn't work. And that's because, we're not really focused on the system as much as
the individual.
As the individual. So like you can tell people you need to be compassionate, But if you look at the and empathetic and whatever, right? But then if you look at sort of like, what gets you ahead in an organization, and maybe it is about kissing up, and maybe it is about taking credit when you don't deserve it. Maybe it is about undermining your rival, because there's only one person out of six, who's going to get that job, so you're never going to really be that kind of a person. So if the system is sending you a signal that is incompatible with everything you learn about in a book or in the exec ed program you went to, you're going to go eventually. You're going to be conditioned by the system. So for what works, so all I'm saying is, fine, maybe read that book, go to that exec ed program, try to. You need to do some individual work. Change does start with you, 100%. But that can't be. You can't put your hopes on that, right? Because there's the evidence is clear. That's not going to work. That's not going to be enough. So you do need to change the system.
Just a second.
Yeah.
Before we continue to what we do need to do, because I found this fascinating. I want to dive into this a bit, and then you continue. Okay. So, you're talking about people going to 1 or 2 week offsites.
Yeah.
1 or 2 weeks compared to what I see organizations do is a lot. Most organizations, struggle to send their leaders for 2 days into some kind of program. And now, and the science that you refer to, the studies that you refer to are based on this 1 or 2 weeks. And even those didn't have the expected return in the long run. So this is something that organizations, especially people in learning and development or HR or whatever, they really need to hear this. So after our conversation, Michele, if you can, send me some of the research around this, because this is a topic that I would then also love to deep dive into a bit more, as this affects my own work, like dealing with leaders, teaching them in these 1 or 2 day workshops. And my intention is to make it as sustainable as possible. And I know, and this is now where I hand over to you again, that there are systematic changes needed beyond the individual. But the more I understand the science behind individual development, I think we can also do a better job here. But now I hand over to you again about what kind of changes we need in the overall org.
Yeah, sure. No, and I would say, I think individual change is really important. You need to start there, as I mentioned before. It's not just something to ignore. But as I mentioned, and there's plenty of evidence, but somehow it's an uncomfortable fact that, most people in management don't want to talk about, certainly not business schools who make a lot of money, doing exec ed. But what is the evidence? The evidence, studies and surveys of executives would tell you, we're just not getting the skills we need. These, we're not really, we're not happy with the leadership development. We're not happy with the leadership development function. We're spending a bunch of money on it. And at some point we should ask ourselves, okay, do we need to kind of step back and rethink this a little bit, right? Because if maybe we're just doing this the wrong way. But by the way, the other thing that I think is really wrong with how this these programs are structured is that it's stratified, right? So you have, look at any kind of business school, and when they offer training courses for the organization, you got managing the organization at the top level, then you got leading the business at the middle level, and on the lower level you have leading the team. So basically, it's the underlying assumption here, is that people who are supervisors, and certainly people below that level, are incapable of thinking about what leading the organization or thinking beyond their own role, right? So you are circumscribing leadership development or professional development around this really self-limiting idea that certain people ought to focus on narrow things, and other people need to think about the big picture. It's total BS. Some people actually further down in the organization can have a better sense of the whole business and the biggest threats to the whole business than someone at the top who's going to be insulated from reality by layers and layers of people, as well as very old mindsets, right? So this whole idea, I'll stop here and maybe we'll get on to your other question, but you see these charts about leadership competencies, and they're like different things, and that you need to be, you need to be good at, and then they have like, it's a checklist, like you have competencies and then levels of the organization. So one of the competencies is like thinking strategically, and there's typically an X to that if you're like an SVP, EVP, maybe a director. But as you go down the chain, the hierarchy, down to team leader, whatever, thinking strategically is not like a key skill. And like, that's insane. You're basically telling 80% of the company that they shouldn't
think strategically.
Don't think strategically. It's insane. It's insane. And sometimes you have to step back and like do some critical thinking and saying, what are those kind of assumptions that we almost take for granted? Because you read almost anything out there about leadership and you're like, forced leadership means someone at the top. But like, does that even make sense? And so sometimes it's good to step back and being a little critical. Anyway, so that's, I'll stop the rant. So what needs to happen? I mean, as I mentioned, and maybe we get into this humanocracy idea as a way to get here, and to your point earlier about like the fact that human beings need to be at the center. So so you need to do your homework as an individual, but as I said, you need to, there's a lot that you need to do at the level of the organizational system that you're designing. And the problem is that the organizational system, the organizational DNA, the organizational operating system, whatever metaphor you want to use, that runs most large-scale organization is built on a set of principles that might have made sense 150 years ago, 100 years ago, but no longer make sense today. They're based on principles of stratification, as we mentioned before, that power starts at the top and then trickles down, right? And they're that you're basically compartmentalizing decisions at different levels. It's based on this idea of specialization. People have very narrow, as narrow as to make things clear, right? Make it narrow roles as possible. That a formalization where you're just basically putting boxes around people and saying this is your job, this is what you need to work on. And unless we change that formally with a reorg or whatever, that's what you need to focus on, and don't think about anything else, right? And then standardization, this fact that we are going to specify in as detailed way as possible, everything we do, like our procedures, our policies, and these things in a way, in some basic sense, are actually not bad as principles. And certainly they're helpful to create order when you have chaos, and when the name of the game was efficiency at scale, and you were dealing with semi-literate workers, and the pace of change was very slow. This made total sense, and so like we gotta recognize that. But in a world where people are highly skilled, where change is hypersonic. Where winning isn't just about being producing the widgets at the cheapest possible price, but it is about harnessing new insights in fast ways and being highly effective and responsive. These principles are not going to be enough, right? So and you need to kind of reimagine the organization in a way that doesn't treat, because all these principles all had this assumption that the goal of the organization was maximizing conformance, right? You just needed to have a plan that was thought of by the big, the smart people at the top, and everybody else basically needed to shut up and kind of deliver. And in that kind of a system, the individual is nothing more than an instrument, right? It's a resource that you're using to deliver on your goal, right? And so human resources, now we call them, the HR function is now called people in culture, whatever. It's probably better than the human resources, but still there's this very instrumental view of the person. And what we need to do is change that and say, well, maybe, and that's what really the focus of Humanocracy is all about, is like, how do you flip that around so that the organization is the instrument and the person is the agent, right? And the person is using the organization to better their lives and the lives of the people that person is serving, the customer, other stakeholders, and the like. And it sounds like wordplay, but it's actually fairly profound, because if you want to make that flip, where the organization is the tool and the person is the instrument, then you have to embrace very different principles from the ones I mentioned before. Principles like meritocracy, principles like openness, principles like ownership. And we basically in the book go through 7 principles and unpack them and provide examples of companies that do that. And back to your question about leadership, so we kind of tie this and then we can go anywhere you want, Sohrab, with this, is that the fundamental premise is that in these kinds of organizations that operate with these kinds of principles, the assumption is anybody can really be a leader, and leadership operates on this premise that it's really about value added, and the job of people who are in positional power is to multiply leaders, create more leaders, and where ultimately they're accountable to the lead. They're not accountable to the higher ups, and that's the big change. And for that to happen, you need very different approaches to the management model, right? So we talk a lot about business models, but the management model is basically a collection of choices you make around how decisions are made, how strategies decided, how resources are allocated, how people are hired, how people are promoted, how networks are formed in the organization. And it's those kinds of decisions which are more difficult than sending someone to a 5-day exec ed program that shape the leadership environment in a company. And just because they're hard doesn't mean that they're not worthwhile. And in fact, you have to make those kinds of demanding changes to the organization if you want to hope for something different than the status quo, right? Otherwise, you're just hoping for something to change when the whole system is not really geared up to change. And you're going to end up being frustrated and just wonder, like, we spent all that money on leadership development, nothing has changed. Well, that's why, because like the organization really the organizational reality hasn't matched the leadership rhetoric you're espousing.
Yeah. And sometimes it's really just leadership rhetoric, right? Because even within HR, or they can call themselves today people and culture, the assumptions based on which the leadership program in itself was created are not reflected on. So the other week, I spoke to Roger Martin about his new book, A New Way to Think, where he unpacks a ton of like models that drive our decision making and our actions, and then goes into, okay, so why is this model wrong, and what kind of model could serve us better in today's day and age? And we referred earlier to that the traditional management was not designed for the challenges that we're facing today. And there's this great video from Gary, which I think I found like 6-7 years ago, and I think it's from 2011, where he like clearly puts it out like, okay, management 1.0 was created for a certain intention, and it did a good job back then. Now, even for that, there were different models. I read a book a few years ago. It was called The Untitled Capitalist.
Yes.
I don't know. And this person like shows a bunch of organizations that even if you think about illiterate people working on the assembly line or whatever, if you create an environment where you tap into their creativity, where you empower them, where you put them at the center of your actions, you could achieve much, much better results than any form of what we refer to as traditional management or leadership, right? So I think there is a lot of things that we need to rethink. And you and Gary work on this, like hacking management, etc., which I think is very valuable. And you mentioned it's like making the employee, the agent, and the organization the tool, and not the other way around, might be a slight change, but as was the Copernican change, right?
Yeah. No,
it sounds like a small change, but it results in you and us, all of us, thinking about every single aspect of how we treat people completely differently, of what we expect from them completely differently, and what we want the organization to be completely differently, right? These are the small, once we understand those things, and then we think about, okay, what are going to be the implications given my current model? I think that's when then the interesting conversations and the hard decisions need to be made. Right.
I think that's right. No, it's a big shift. And, and even though the book is called Humanocracy, and it may sound by the way it's framed that this is kind of a touchy-feely book.
No, it's not.
So we would argue that there is a moral imperative because to treat people better at work and allow each person to flourish and be the best they can be in the workplace, and that it is like a complete moral indictment that the Gallup data shows that only 1 in 5 employees feels like their opinions seem to count at work, or that less than 1 in maybe 1 in 10, or maybe less than 1 in 10 feels that they can kind of be creative at work and take risks to improve the customer experience. That to me is like shameful, and the fact that we're not calling companies out for this the way we might call them out for, like, I don't know, pollution is like, I don't know, to me it's mystifying. But so there's a moral case for this, but there's also a very pragmatic kind of business case for this, because both Gary and I came to this almost from the strategy angle more than the people angle. We're not HR people or OB people necessarily, we're more strategy people. And the realization is, as you mentioned before, Sohrab, is that the world is quite different from what it was in the early 20th century, and companies need to be much more resilient. They're much more able to change faster, as fast as the world around them, right? And I mean, just think about like all the automakers and the fact that they're like more than a decade late to the EV game, and like it's not as if somehow the trends around them were inscrutable. They just were incapable. So, and for a variety of reasons we can unpack or not. But anyway, so you need to be adaptable. To be adaptable, you need to create a company where people can be creative and can act upon their creativity, and they can be entrepreneurial. So you need to have an innovation advantage. So you have to, that backs up, so because unless you have that, you're not going to be able to respond to what's changing around you. And then to create that kind of environment where people are creative and can kind of act upon their creativity and entrepreneurial kind of energy, you need to have an engagement advantage, or you need to have an inspiration advantage. You have to have an organization that inspires people to have extraordinary talent. So and that obviously means being deeply human. So it's almost like a nested argument. So you need to be human so that people can kind of maximize their contribution, because that's what's going to get you the innovation, and not some sort of like hipster money pit, lab, venture capital incubator somewhere on the side. It's just making everybody feel like they can be an entrepreneur and an innovator, and that then gets you the resilience advantage. So we come at this from how can we get companies to be much more resilient? And the answer is by overhauling the management model. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of focus on operating models and business models. Everybody knows what a business model is, and tries to kind of innovate upon that. Very few people think with the same level of interest and curiosity and sophistication about the management model. But the management model, we would argue, is the fundamental driver of the organizational capability. It's basically it's upstream from the business model. So you're not going to get so you might get most companies that are innovative may have an innovative business model, but they're incapable of doing the second act and changing that, right? So a lot of companies that are innovative on the Fast Company, most innovative companies list, are one-hit wonders. They have a very innovative business model, but then it runs its course and that company drops off the list. If you want a company that continues to be innovative, that continues to evolve its business model and makes that innovation, that innovative, you need to have a management model that allows that business model innovation to flourish. And so that's why we're very kind of hard-nosed about it. And but it is, as I said, it is work, because you are talking about making a big shift. And I think one of the reasons why you mentioned Peter O'Toole's book, Untitled Chapter, is why those are still the exception than the rule, despite the fact that they demonstrate significant advantages, is because those kinds of changes are countercultural. They threaten those in position of power, and they are, they take time, right? And you gotta persevere. And in today's environment, if you're a CEO, you're like, well, like maybe the way I juice up, I understand this is like the work I need to do, but it might be easier for me to just do an acquisition or do share buybacks or whatever, and juice up performance that way, right? Which is a little bit our challenge as we seek to get this, to spread.
Yeah. Share buybacks are the most innovative approach to drive up your stock price. But yeah, no, you mentioned a few things in here. So I fully agree with you about the management model being something that needs to be changed, because once you establish a new management model, and I actually like the term operating system much better than an operating model, because then you can also bring in analogies from the computer space. Apple was not able, didn't become that successful with the iPhone taking the Mac OS operating system. They had to create a whole new operating system. Now, this operating system of the iPhone initially was not that strong, but it powered the iPhone and it delivered on the specific things like not using that much battery, etc. And over time, it became more and more and more powerful, especially when you put it on an iPad, right? And I think organizations, if they now want to achieve different outcomes, and if you speak to CEOs, I mean, have you met a CEO that doesn't want their organization to be more innovative?
Yeah.
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 Hey, so I haven't seen anyone.
Yeah. No. Right. Well. Yeah. And by the way, I'm just putting up on the shared. Hopefully, our audience can see it. Just a little bit of so that we make this a little bit more concrete. How we think about the management model and components of it, right? And so, what you really need to do, back to your point about innovation, like, and what are the principles that drive innovation, and then how do we make every one of these things something that encourages rather than frustrates innovation? So, right. So, how do we allocate capital? How do we design tasks? How do we structure ourselves? How do we develop people, right? Do we give them tools? Do we train them in lean startup or other methodologies? Do we make people accountable for innovative actions? Yeah. Do we make leaders accountable or managers accountable for innovation in their teams? How do we make sure that in something like compliance or risk management doesn't kill innovation? How can we get the discipline and safety and whatever without killing initiative? And so, so it's really about being very systematic and thinking about like what needs to happen, what needs to change. And in the book we talk about a bunch of companies: Haier, Vinci, Handelsbanken, Nucor, W.L. Gore, and others. Many other
airlines,
Birds or whatever. And what they all did is they've thought very systematically about changing these kinds of aspects of their organization in light of these principles that I mentioned. I actually didn't. I mentioned some of them earlier, but the point is, they started from this premise. Like, these are the kinds of things we value. These are the kinds of things that will make us more adaptable, more innovative, more engaging. How do we embed these principles in the way we manage? So it's not just like, hey, let's get a few leaders to become more humble or whatever for a week, but rather, how do we change the organizational reality for most people, right? And so that's what you really need to do, because even in innovation, again, like, how many books have been written about innovation, right? And it's and I think most organizations still suck. They really do.
Yeah.
Like, they do. And it's not because they don't have the resources. Well, some of these companies have like tons of cash, know-how, and whatever it is. And it's not because somehow they haven't figured out how to make their incubator work. It's just because they've taken this very kind of bureaucratic approach to innovation and very self-limiting approach to innovation, very elitist way. And that's the result, right? And so you really have to, if you want to build an innovative company, you need to change the organizational, what did you call it? The operating system?
The operating system, the operating model, the management model, whatever we want to call this. But it's those things.
Yeah. And I think you need to go beyond, to me, like, the only other thing I would say, I know we're running out of time, But this whole notion of explore and exploit, and the fact that you need to ring fence the exploration to a side of the organization and just put the smart people there, and they figure out the future while everybody else is like heads down in turning the crank. To me, that's like a very bad model. To me, like the whole company should be a laboratory for innovation. You shouldn't cordon it off. You should. I mean, maybe there's certain things that you want to have certain people look at, but in general, that model where you're saying, there's the innovative part of the company, and then there's like everybody else is sweating in the mines. To me, that's just like you're basically telling 90%, 95% of the company, don't worry about the future, don't worry about innovation. That to me is like such a bad way of thinking about the innovation problem.
And to add to that, I mean, you also lose the opportunity of innovating where innovation usually happens, which is right at the customer, right? Because if you have like a core group of people in some kind of incubator thinking about innovation, usually those people, I mean, they're going to run customer interviews, they're going to create their personas and all of that, but they're not in the day-to-day. Right? If you have a sales rep who's talking to customers every single day, they're going to see things that you cannot see if you run a 1-hour interview. And getting that perspective into the development of new products and services and the continuous improvement of existing products and services, I think that is invaluable. But these people need to be also trained. So when we speak about everyone being in charge of or participating in strategy, right? Thinking strategically. That's what we had, right? Everybody contributing to innovation. For me, this also means like everybody needs to get some basic understanding, some basic training in these topics. And one topic that I struggle with, and I want to get your like honest perspective on this, is when I look at organizations, I see usually development of people, be it leaders, be it sales, be it whatever, is in the hands of HR, learning and development, people and culture, whatever we want to call them. Now, when I think about the field of work where I started my career in, which is medicine, and then the next field of work where I went into, which was management consulting with Bain, the development of me as a young medical doctor, later as a young consultant, was not in the hands of HR. They coordinated, but the people who taught me were the people who were doing the job. So I was watching a surgeon and learning from that person to cutting and stitching and all of that. I had a management consultant teach me how to do an Excel model and give a presentation and all of that. And I don't see enough leaders and enough managers in organization to be really involved in the development of the next generation of managers. I don't see them having that mindset of teaching, but I know there were people that had that mindset. For example, Andy Grove famously taught people at Intel about management. How do you look at that, Michele? Do you also see that problem, or is it just me who is struggling with that?
No, I think, HR's footprint has definitely increased. Now, it also may have to do with the fact that HR is giving you training in areas that don't really have, they're more like peripheral to your job, but it's the capabilities that a lot of this might be compliance driven. I don't know, but this whole idea of on the job training and development is absolutely key. I mean, and I think the evidence shows that's where you get most of your learning. And one company that we feature in the book, Nucor, is incredible at this. I mean, by the way, they have like a really small HR department. I mean, the whole headquarters, a 26,000 person company. The headquarters is 100 people, and they don't really have a lot of corporate programs, training programs happening, and a lot of it has to do with cross training and on the job training. So you actually go and work in other departments because they're managed with these teams that are they're basically very empowered, but they still need to work with other teams, and so having you get a broader sense of like the whole business is important. So you get to train other departments to understand their perspective. You get a lot of business training. Everybody knows. In one of the cafeterias I went to, in one of their plants in Arkansas, they had return on assets numbers in the cafeteria. Whiteboard, everybody, blue-collar workers knows what return on asset means. They know how to calculate it. They know why it matters to the business. They understand the drivers of it. They have, so everybody has like business acumen skills and so on. And and that is the responsibility of the line. Because capability is seen as a human capability, and skills are seen as a line, a driver of line performance. And so, I think, it's easy though for managers, and I can see why they might want to offload some of that to HR so they can do other things. But as you say, it's a responsibility that it has to be an integral part of their job, whether it's a technical skill, a business skill, or an administrative management skill that needs to be part of what they do, and they need to be evaluated on the basis of, are they delivering that to their teams or not? And most of the time, it's not. What HR, or maybe there's an opportunity for HR, finance, and others to be involved, is to put together maybe programs that are, I guess, less about compliance and more about capability building around business skills or entrepreneurial skills and so on. Because you can't have an open strategy process or an open innovation process that works, I think, unless you give people the tools to and to apply, to acquire skills and then apply them in that process. Because otherwise, you're going to be very disappointed. Like, I'm sure you've had your share of clients that come to you and say, "Hey, we ran this open innovation thing, this idea contest, and the ideas were crap." Well, maybe part of I actually think most of the biggest reasons for why the ideas were crap is that either you didn't set this up successfully in terms of framing the challenge and what you're trying to get and why, but also because you didn't give people the tools to think very smartly about the challenge and generating problems. It's like telling someone who's never played golf, "Hey, listen, I'm going to give you a bunch of golf clubs. You go on the course and we want you to hit the ball, 200 yards straight." Well, if you don't give them lessons, you can give them the best clubs in the world. Yeah. So but when it comes to innovation, we have this idea that somehow all you need to do is put up a platform and magic happens. No, that's not how it works. You need to give people the skills. And maybe that is a role that, some corporate function can play. Like, how can we upskill, if you're like a large organization, thousands of people, in business innovation skills, in lean startup skills, and then ask them for their ideas. I mean, that's something that they could do. But to your point, the line and management, building skills and capabilities, if that's not part of what they're accountable for at the end of the year, then that's definitely a big gap.
Yeah. So, Michele, we're getting close to the end of our time box, and I promise you that we finish on time. I want to just quickly wrap this up. So, we talked about one of the conventional flaws in the conventional wisdom is that management is looked at something that is positional and not so much relational. And you brought up the term natural dynamic hierarchy, which I liked a lot, and probably in one of our conversations in the future, we can dive deeper into this. And we already had a few of those principles. We talked about the importance not of time to decision, but more time to impact. And if you spend a bit more time and create the environment where decisions can be decentralized, you definitely get a better time to impact in that sense. You talked about what doesn't work in leadership development, which is the traditional approach of sending people for 1 day, 2 days, maybe even 2 weeks into some kind of program where they work on their individual characteristic. This is important. Individual change is needed. But if it's just that, it's going to end within a few months, maybe after 6 months. And in order to sustainably succeed, we need to look at the organizational operating model or system or the management model, whatever we want to call this, and make significant changes in terms of how are we going to restructure finance or HR or whatever in terms of the impact that we want to achieve. If we want to be more innovative than we are today, we need to change that model. If we want to deliver higher quality than we deliver today, we need to change that model. So for all your contributions and the case studies you mentioned along the line, I want to thank you very, very much. And I love that you ended with the concept or the case study of Nucor, because the last time I checked, their company slogan is not "we're the biggest steel maker." It's building people, not products. And that really emphasizes on the importance of developing people and allowing them to become better versions of themselves and better contributors than they could ever be. So thank you for that conversation. I'm sure this was not our last one. Do you have any last things to say? If you want, go ahead. Otherwise, very much appreciated that you've been here with us.
Thanks, Sohrab. Thanks for the opportunity. You did a great summary. I was very impressed. And I'm sorry we didn't get into a lot of the specific cases. I mentioned nuclear in passing. The book is full of them. Perhaps we can unpack some of them and some of these principles. Just get super granular if and when you want. The only other thing I might say is that people go to humanocracy.com. They can download some resources that explain some of our core concepts in more detail. And there's also a course, which is like a mini MOOC called Hack My Org that they can take, where Gary and I go much deeper in all of this. So if you're interested, you can check that out, humanocracy.com.
Yeah, we will definitely link it below the video. Michele, thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Sohrab.